outside government, we have SPA, on opposition, we have Victorian institution. Before we start the debate, I would like to advise everyone to please not speak, especially without speaking. Wow. Please do not speak in the middle of the debate because it echoes in the room. It's very, very disruptive. If you want to leave the room, please do it in between speakers. Alright? And also, please silence the room. Alright, without further ado, on motion, this House believes that it is justified to withhold developmental aid from nations that have instituted policies that violate human rights and liberties. Now I'd like to welcome Prime Minister.
When countries or dictators or leaders of this nation actively oppress the situation and some people within this particular country, it's one that is horrible. But it's even worse when other nations fuel that hatred or fuel that form of oppression by providing them with this form of aid. We think that this needs to be a conditional form of aid starting from now. Our policy, or just how we're going to run this debate, right? Simple. We're going to make developmental aid conditional on how you make your policies. If and when you change your policies to be less human rights oppressive, then we will provide you back with your developmental aid. The problems that we wanted to solve inside government is threefold. Number one, countries that have been violating human rights for far too long, and they will not be doing it for far too long, they'll be doing it for far damaging manner. That means they think they can do whatever they want. For example, Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan, or Epali Nailatiku in the country of Fiji. In these examples, dictators or these kinds of leaders in the status quo already have the ability to oppress these individuals, suppress them to an extent where they don't have the liberty to even walk as a free human being. We think it's important to do so, where they even hold people in custody for no good reason, right? Secondly, we think countries assume that these countries assume that they have the full autonomy to do whatever they want because no one will ever get involved within that particular nation because of the idea of sovereignty and so on and so forth. Number three, we think that the aid that these individuals provide directly fuel this particular situation, making it harder, making it worse, making it far more painful for the individuals that are on the ground. One argument for you today, Madam Chair. I'll be analyzing the principal justification as to why it's justified for you to make this imposition upon these particular nations and why this policy will necessarily work. Before that, any clarifications? No, right. Firstly, move on to the feasibility, because they're going to question, right, how is it going to work, and so on and so forth. We think, firstly, it's very important to understand twofold. Number one, the autonomy that countries have over these nations when it comes to developmental aid or these particular forms of aid is extremely high. For example, developmental aid in Uganda is controlled by a majority of the outer nation by 89%. For example, we think it's feasible. When it comes to nations like Britain, when they stop developmental aid to Malawi, when they oppress human rights, they immediately switch their policies to become more human rights friendly. We think that this is an example. We want to bring that same and equate that same outcome in this debate. We think that's important to understand. Secondly, we think the conditional aid is extremely important within these nations. When it comes to developmental aid, is extremely important within these nations. When it comes to developmental aid, it's the ability for you to build schools, for you to build infrastructures, for you to have a unity in society that functions in general. That means it's important to understand that developmental aid is extremely important towards these nations, especially when these nations are not that rich to begin with. Why is this important? Because when it comes to the economy that majority of these nations have, like Fiji, like Afghanistan, we think in these kinds of nations, we think it's important to understand that the leaders are not that stupid to begin with. They understand the autonomy that other nations have upon them. If you cut off the developmental aid, then therefore the country cannot function anymore. We think they will be more inclined to go and opt into your policy. We think they will do that anyway. But number two, even if they don't, and this is the worst case scenario, that they still want to be stubborn and don't want to respond to your changes and whatever you want to impose onto them, we think society will naturally reform because of the importance of that particular developmental aid in this particular situation. We think that they can vote him out in the next election, or that there's a natural check and balance that exists there. So feasibility is not a problem. Before I move on, yeah, your question.
So what is stopping on the other side of the house once the institutions are built for the government and all the infrastructures are built for aid to be done towards in the form of active discrimination?
We think that when you stop something that they need so direly, they will have no choice but to respond by accepting to whatever conditions that you have. That's what happens. If you want something from something, and if I tell you you have to do this in order to get that particular something, then you will more likely do it because you have no choice but to do that something, right? We think, I don't know why the PO I was asked, but why must you make it conditional? Three reasons, sorry. Number one, we think that a human rights violation within this particular nation that is going on for far too long. People are dying, people don't have the ability to even voice out their own concern within these nations, especially when it comes to a particular group of people, when they stigmatize individuals to a particular society and segregate these individuals to portions of society. We think it's not fair for these individuals. But the second harm that exists is your money isn't used in the best interest of everyone, because the intention that you have in developmental aid is that your money will be used for the benefit of every individual, that everyone can benefit from the school that you build, that everyone can benefit from the hospital that you build. But is that necessarily being happening? Because when human rights violations exist, not every individual will be able to benefit from all the outcomes that you necessarily provide to them. Only some particular individuals or the particular majority that you don't want to oppress within status quo will only benefit from these circumstances. We think it's a moral obligation that countries have in order to make this conditional, so that every individual within these oppressed nations will have the ability to enjoy all these liberties within status quo. It's important to understand to begin with, because now you give the power, give it to the people. It's not fair, but it's also completely derogatory in nature. The third thing is that your money fuels the economy, because the economy that the people have is that as long as they have the money, as long as they have the power within their own hands, they have the constant power to eliminate you and ignore you when it comes to you trying to stand up for your own self. When you limit this possibility, when you don't have the money anymore within status quo, it's important to recognize that this policy will change for the better. So people won't die, people will not be able to not voice out their concerns, people will get a say, people will be able to benefit from all those liberties that you intended to do. Because the money that you are using, and this is a lot of money coming from nations who provide aid to these particular nations, will be used in the best interest for every individual for that particular country. We think it's important. Better perception we backed up with a positive connotation once this policy has been reinstated. Before I move on,
what is the difference between stopping this particular aid in order for them to accept this, and giving them the threat of stopping it and monitor them so that you don't oppress people?
Sir, a threat will not work if you don't dare do that particular thing. If you don't dare actually go and stop that particular aid and say, haha, I'm going to stop it, it doesn't necessarily work within status quo. You have to have the ability, you have to have the guts to do it, then therefore we're actually going to do it. If you're going to monitor them and just threaten them, we don't think it's already working, because threats already have failed within status quo, Madam Chair. We think it's important to understand. The second argument on societal perception and how we back up positive connotations, especially within these nations where they're already pushed to a corner, where they already are instilled that you don't have a say, you will never be able to have a say within status quo. We think it's important to have this policy. What is the current situation? Number one, countries already assume that they have full autonomy over the people in the country. But the countries also assume that no one will dare step into a particular nation, then therefore they will constantly oppress this nation. Number one, why is this beneficial? You drop the stereotype, you drop the connotation that you can easily oppress people as a particular individual with status quo. When you see another country being controlled by a nation who's providing aid, we think you're more likely to respond in the same manner that a particular country responded to. What does this mean? That means leaders in the future, especially when it comes to societies that are easily oppressible, or in these kinds of societies where conservative, when people control the situation within these countries, it's important to understand now you keep the future leaders within a particular form of check and balance. That means if you, in the future, you understand that another country was suffering because as a result of their violation of human rights, I probably shouldn't violate the human rights within my own nation so that I don't suffer the same exact problem. We think it's important to learn. But secondly, we think that people also have the ability to know what their rights are. In these circumstances, you understand that people will change for the better, Madam Chair, because they understand that this country is standing up for me and my own rights. Why shouldn't I stand up for my own rights? For all those reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you. Welcome to the developmental. Come here.
Very good.
Opposition basically wants to tell you that basically when they enact this policy, and it can only happen when a government cares about the people, right? We tell you that when in the condition where this government doesn't care about people, when you don't we think that when the government doesn't care for these people, right? We tell you that even if you're going to withhold this developmental aid, even if you weren't going to give them any developmental aid, we tell you that that's not going to change any situations in the society, right? Tell you that with the amount of resources that they still have in the country, with the amount of resources that's still present inside the country, we tell you that they will use this aid. They'll use these resources to further oppress these people, and I will continue to continue to tell you about this in my second substantive today, right? Yes, I'm moving on to my first substantive about how there's a need for this developmental aid to ensure that the country is able to sit down. That the country is able to progress, and this country is able to progress beyond all the barbaric beyond all these barbaric actions that they do, all these oppressive things that they do. We think that when you do this, these countries will normally, these countries after receiving this aid will become more globalized, and we have to recognize the benefits of this developmental aid and how it will facilitate many forms of organic change. Yes.
These people already don't care about the people within the nation. These leaders don't really give a damn about people. Our policy forces them to take consideration of what the people have to say and don't violate their human rights. What are you doing?
Okay, like I've told you, when you withhold these things, they will use our resources that they still have in their hands to continue oppressing people, because you have given them a reason to continue oppressing people, because they are the only reason why you're not getting this developmental aid. They are the reason why the majority is not being allowed to develop to a further extent, and this will further antagonize them, which I will continue in my second substantive. Right? And back to my first substantive about how this developmental aid is important to establish themselves as global players. It's important to put them inside the limelight. We recognize that the limelight is very important, because now this country will continuously be under more scrutiny. This country will be more under the limelight. And we tell you that when the media is already there, the media will already be telling everyone that yes, this country has been violating human rights. And when they accept this developmental aid, there will be more scrutiny on their part. Right? We tell you that on our side of the house, we think that by ensuring that they're continuously getting this developmental aid, you are instilling a form of mindset that will allow them to progress and allow them to one day and ensure that one day they will comply to international human rights standard. Right? Yes.
You might not care about your people. You can be an oppressive person. But recognizing that your resources run out and developmental aid is what keeps you in power, why don't these individuals make a legitimate choice?
Yeah. Good.
We tell you that with all the resources that they have, you're not going to do any help to these people in the long term, right? Because at the end of the day, when the country really comes out and really runs out of resources, these people are already oppressed to the max, and we tell you that you're not solving anything at all, right? But furthermore, we tell you that when this developmental aid is given to them, it's important because you facilitate organic change. Why does it facilitate organic change? Right? We tell you that when you give these people, this country, developmental aid, allow them to build schools, because we recognize that education is important in ensuring that these people learn a more progressive mindset. And we tell you that when these countries are now global players, and when this country are under more scrutiny, we tell you that whenever they enact policies that are getting out of hand, we tell you that other countries will intervene and other countries won't be happy about what they do. Sit down. We tell you that this developmental aid is actually a form of supervision, it's actually a form of regulation, and not what they portray to you about how it actually helps. We think that it actually defeats the purpose of all these things. Right? On my second substantive, on where most of my rebuttals are into, right, we tell you that this will increase the antagonization towards these minorities. Right? We tell you that there are two levels and there are two stakeholders who start to feel antagonized onto these people. Right, first is the state, and the second is a majority, where a majority of people who in the state. Right, we tell you that when this policy is enacted, and when countries withhold the developmental aid from the nations, we tell you that the majority will start to antagonize the minorities, because now they see minorities as the reason why the country cannot progress. We tell you that this is extremely problematic, and we tell you that this will not solve any problem, because you are further antagonizing them, you're further increasing the harm towards these oppressive people. We tell you in the long we tell you in the long term that's not going to help anything at all. And second of all, on the states part, right? We tell you that when states when you withhold this developmental aid from these states, we tell you that these states will continue to oppress you, like how I've told you just now. And second of all, we tell you that on the stakeholder analysis of how sit down before the of the people who are being antagonized, the minorities, right? We tell you that they will start to develop a form of self-repressive psychology. They will start to blame themselves because of the constant antagonization and the constant scrutiny, constant antagonization that is happening every day. Right? We tell you that this extremely bad and this self-repressive psychology will never help them progress in any way. But what have I told you today? I've told you about the needs for this developmental aid and how it's beneficial, and I've told you about how when you do this, you actually increase the antagonization towards the minorities, and we tell you that at the end of the day, it doesn't help to solve the problem, it doesn't help to protect these minorities with them proud to oppose.
Yeah. Thank you. I would now like to welcome the GPM.
Minorities within countries like this were already antagonized the moment this country started to be oppressive. These individuals who are excluded from policies and excluded from being awarded liberties or being awarded rights is something that we wanted to fight for. That's why the extreme comparison of a person being awarded his rights but receiving some form of scrutiny from society couldn't match up to the fact that they were willing to sacrifice this person not being able to go to hospitals, this person not being able to go to schools, as comparison to mere media and the influence it has over these people. We recognize that there's a trade-off that has to be made, and over time the perception towards these minorities can change. But the facilitation and respect can only start at a point where we start to take these chances and we start to have some form of respect towards these minorities by not just making claims and threats, by taking actual actions. I have two arguments for you today. Firstly, how corruption itself, how we limit the standards for corruption in developing countries, how there's a maximization of developmental aid within circumstances like this. And number two, how we maximize all forms of alternatives in trying to curb these kinds of countries into becoming more within the light. That once this country becomes fully developed, that is when they receive more scrutiny. That is when the countries will intervene within them, and that's when more people will die, Mr. Speaker. We don't need interventions. We need people within these kinds of circumstances in their vulnerable in the vulnerable stages of the country, in itself oppressing its people, to take measures that save more lives. We need to take measures that in itself even more better. Before that, a few levels of rebuttals. Because he tried to tell us that governments don't care about their people. And he said the governments will run on the resources that they currently have, and then they won't do anything about it except these kinds of circumstances. Firstly, it's developmental aid, not humanitarian aid. That means we're not the government won't even if the government doesn't care about its people, it's not harming its people in any sense. It's about the developmental aid and how you build structures within these circumstances. This is nothing to concern the people. That means if the government wants to progress and stay in power, it will need this developmental aid, regardless of whether they want to care for their people or not. At the end of the day, developmental aid is an important element for these individuals to progress as countries. And we think that every rational individual who doesn't want to be overthrown, because that's what they run on the assumption of, will take this developmental aid up to this point. But they try to argue that, you know what, no, they will still say no towards your developmental aid and all your conditions. Firstly, in itself, we always have conditions in our everyday lives as to how we give That's how we give aid to various countries. This negates the very fact that we are willing to make trade-offs with certain circumstances. Because under our paradigm, even in the best case scenario, where these countries neglect this developmental aid and neglect all the demands, their resources will run out, they can't function as a country, and this is when these people, and the reality sets in, that they can't even function on their own. Yeah. This is why these individuals are more condoned towards actually accepting your developmental aid, accepting your demands, and even accepting people for who they are, and not just denying their liberties. But the second response towards this argument, because it tries to tell us that these countries will become global players. This is a problem that we had. Sure, you can have all the media scrutiny that you want. Sure, that all these countries will be receiving excessive forms of hatred. But the very fact is, people are still dying. People are still suffering in these countries and not being given the liberties and rights to fight for it. Why would you wait for an intervention, or why would you wait for an action to be taken in the future if you already identified the problem within these circumstances? We don't necessarily think they had any form of counter to it. But then it says this is oriental change, because now you give give these countries chances to build schools and hospitals. Yes, we're fine with that, but that's only if it's exclusive to everyone within society, and you don't just exclude it to these particular groups of individuals. But then the last rebuttal, because it's trying to tell us that you're going to antagonize minorities. Firstly, this is the perception that already fluently goes within this entire society. The minorities are necessarily individuals who are bad, and we should not respect them. Why should we never counter these kinds of perceptions? We need to set new standards, and that can only be set from foreign forces who already have some form of power in shaping these individuals into becoming less of brainwashed circumstances. Why is this good? Because the very fact these individuals are already antagonized. We take these forms of risk into allowing these individuals to get all the liberties they necessarily can, while the only sacrifice that they make is the very fact that they're already antagonized to begin with. So we protect these individuals, and we recognize that the perception towards these individuals who are not being awarded rights will change over time. But that can only happen when we take certain forms of action. First argument, developing countries, and considering the fact that they are coupled with individuals who violate human rights, shows that these individuals don't care about social needs. Structure within the country, and they only care about the structure, that the physical structure that naturally exists. Why is this a problem? Because for a country to progress, you don't necessarily only have to have proper structures. You don't necessarily only have to have FDIs within your country. You need to have people having good cooperations with the government. You need to have people accepting the government, and that's what a social structure actually is. It's important to have good bonds between the people and the government, even in instances where the government is taking extreme measures. The government always makes policies, but what makes them successful is people condoning towards them, or people actually take stance in supporting these policies. What do you mean? Corporations and people in itself need to be affected positively by these policies for this country in itself to progress. Why is this important to recognize? Because this cannot happen in circumstances where these countries in itself and the people within it are already discriminated, the people within it are suppressed and not allowed to contribute within society, and that's something that we need to recognize. Corruption only happens when governments make decisions and governments make investments not based on how people take in an effect, but make decisions based on how they seek profit, on how they seek things like exploitation. Yes, under their paradigm, we can concede that we can have some forms of progression, but under our paradigm, we have multitude forms of progression when people and the governments have better relations. And you can start that off by giving these individuals proper rights. We can give these individuals proper forms of recognitions, even if they're not the minorities from that instance. Second argument, maximization of alternatives. Because even in these instances where they wanted to concede that these countries are bad, these countries are countries that violate human rights, and that's something that no one can accept. What is the problem there? They went on the assumption that these countries will always get aid. The countries will always be there for you to make demands on. This country will not necessarily always be there to have your conditions upon. What is the problem? When this country becomes independent of your aid, when this country does not need your developmental aid anymore, what happens then? Do they have to condone any form of international standards? Do they have to listen to anybody? Because at the end of the day, they've already sucked out enough of these countries. They've already took everything from these countries, and they recognize that they can do that. What is the problem? This is when you put the risk of individuals in this country at stake. This is why we disagree with their characterization. This is when the countries and other countries that have to take hardline stances against them, doing these interventions which harm every other individual within your society, is something that we don't want to condone to. We need to change the perceptions, and we need to take all our advantages in these circumstances, because countries like Uganda, countries like Egypt can't always be there under these circumstances. These countries will become independent of aid. So to acknowledge that this is bad, there's nothing happening and there's nothing stopping these mere countries from exploiting and continuously oppressing its people once they're independent of your aid. They need to come up and give us alternatives. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you. Welcome.
Whatever Kishan said about countries being independent when they've already exploited enough from the countries that offer developmental aid is non-mutually exclusive. Under our paradigm, this can also happen if we sort of make the developmental aid conditional, right? This is the harm that they've chosen to ignore, and this is what I'll further elaborate on. But first, I'll give a few lines of rebuttals. Basically, we don't agree with the fundamental idea of the developmental aids being conditional, whereby whereby you have to fulfill some form of international standard of human rights for you to receive it, right? Sure, we are trying to protect human rights as well. We are not going to come here and tell you that human rights are not important. But at the end of the day, what we tell you is the better way to do this is to offer them this kind of developmental aid non-conditionally. Whatever Roshan and Kishan have said up to this point clashes directly with what Daiwei said. Daiwei, we told you that we need that kind of developmental aid to develop the country to the point where it becomes a global player, to ensure that there'll be international scrutiny and there'll be international pressure whenever they enact a policy that is bad. But why international pressure instead of something instantaneous, right? Just direct retraction of developmental aid whenever something bad happens in a particular country. Now let's just consider this. If something bad in Malawi happens, chances are the only country to notice it is United Kingdom, which provides them with the developmental aid. No other countries would pay attention to this violation of human rights. To the small countries don't even matter on the international stage. But what we are telling you here is that we want to play up these countries who have sort of violated and still is violating human rights up to the stage where they actually have a stake in the international playground to ensure that whenever they do something, so when I say stake, I mean things like economy, commerce, that kind of thing, where they trade with other nations internationally, right? We tell you that whenever they do something wrong at that point in time, where it's actually a country that you can spot on the world map, right? Well, so things like sanction will happen. When we tell you this is even more deterring and this is even more daunting for the countries, right? Things like sanction will be more scary for the countries. Another thing that Daiwei has said is that this would fuel for further antagonization. Sure, it's easy for them to brush them aside and say that they've already been antagonized in status quo. But what we are telling you is they are not doing anything to sort of help them, because these majorities or these dictators will spread propaganda to sort of convince everyone that it's the minorities that are causing the developmental aid to be cut off, right? We tell you that they are not doing anything under their policy to help these people to ensure that this field won't be further propagated, right? Another level that Daiwei have talked about. Okay, now I'll accept one first.
So your problem within these circumstances is that we can't raise enough awareness to curb the problem. Why do we need to raise awareness when the problem can easily be curbed without taking long time actions that raises countries in the international scale? Why is that?
Look, if we don't raise awareness, if this country has only one source of development aid, and if that particular country pull out due to conditions, right? We tell you that there's always like this idea of black market of development aid, where we can take countries who don't sell any form of conditions, like China or Russia, for instance. We tell you that they will turn to these countries who have less stringent conditions, and they will be willing to accept aid from them regardless, right? And we tell you that when they develop to the stage where they are already independent, they don't have to care about you pulling out this developmental aid, and we don't. And we tell you that at this they can have a form of institutionalized persecution, right? Sit down. Now, moving on to the substantive that I want to bring forth today. First, we tell you that if the country is actually smart enough, they will sort of how do I put it, disguise themselves to actually be more and more gravitated towards human rights, right? To be more and more accepting towards these minorities that are being oppressed and that are being persecuted. We tell you that this is harmful. Why? Because once they've already amassed enough of this development aid, they will create an infrastructure, they will create a system that actively persecutes these minorities. We tell you that when they've already disguised for long enough, where they've already developed to the stage where they don't need to fear your cut-off of aid, we tell you that when they can allow you to pull out whenever you want, and when you do, they will further enact policies that can sideline this minority, and we tell you this is a form of institutionalized racism or persecution. I'll take one more.
If international pressure is working so far, why is it that decades have passed and Parliament people constantly oppressing the people of Fiji?
Okay, that's due to the fact that okay, let's put this straight. Even though I have to concede to this, I personally do not know the exact details of what's happening here, but we can very safely assume this. The only reason why this oppression can still exist is because they are accepting aid from countries that are not that stringent about their policies. We tell you that this is exactly what will happen. You push away these third world countries that need aid, right, to countries that are not as concerned about human rights, right? This is exactly what will happen, and this kind of psychological harm will exist, right? Now, what was I talking about? Yeah, I was talking about how if you play the country, if they've received enough aid to the point where they can have a some form of sustainable development, where they no longer have to fear countries from outside, right? They will have no urgency to respond to your cutoff whatsoever. They will have no urgency to sort of react and comply with the conditions. What we are telling you here is a sustainable and a systematic disenfranchisement of those that they want to disenfranchise to begin with. We tell you that they create policies that will sideline these minorities. We tell you they will create infrastructure that is accessible to everyone, but not these minorities. The idea here is that they are trying to keep the country to themselves, but not those who are different from them, the minorities who are being oppressed, right? So we think that this is harmful, and to go to and some countries might even go to the extent where they will try to shoo away these people by continuously oppressing them and hope that they will migrate away or whatsoever, right? We tell you that this is very dangerous harm and a very dangerous prospect that we have to consider when we give these third world countries the avenue to look to sites that are less stringent about their policies. But beyond that, you will also give them a chance to disguise themselves, to suck out as much aid as they want, to develop to the point where they are sustainable, and they don't have to care about your policies towards human rights. And for these reasons, we beg to oppose.
Hi, thank you. I would now like to welcome the government witness.
The hierarchy that we create under our policy is that when you have something to condition with, if you have a higher nation or a nation with higher power below above you, that's when you have that higher value being imposed to you, that value that you have to condone to at the end of the day, because of that social structure that you have been failing to uphold to, because of the human rights that you have been failing to uphold to. If a country that is successful in giving you conditional aid, and you are successful in allowing to condone into that conditional aid, or allowing to condone to the conditions that they give you, and because of that dire situation that they are in, because of that desperate situation that they're in, as we already told you, how it's going to be feasible anyway, they will want your conditional aid, and they will want that implementation that you're going to put on them, because they are highly dependent on developmental aid, and that's a reason for them to accept, or that's a reason for them to acknowledge that there is some form of human rights violations that is going on. They're going to fix their policies into condoning into the factors, to fix in the ideas that will benefit them through a human rights factor. There are two issues in today's debate. First of all, why is it a moral standard when only the country that is giving you developmental aid to set values upon you? And secondly, the implementation that will come out of this policy, and why is it good for everyone? The first issue on why is it a moral standard that we set when only the country that gives you developmental aid sets values to you. Number one, they talked about the idea of how countries will use resources that they already have, and they don't need to conform to the conditions that you're going to give them, because they're going to continue to oppress them anyway, because they're so rogue. That's a characterization that they gave you. But if your argument is that people don't need the developmental aid, people have the resources that they need, that means at the end of the day, first of all, they're going to run out of that aid anyway. But secondly, we will deal with both paradigms. When even if they don't accept the aid, that means they're still going to have the instigate value that there is something going on there. There is something going on with the people, that how I'm treating with my people. That's already going to be a message sent to them that in the way they treat their people. Because even if they don't conform to it, even if they want to get another country to give them developmental aid, that means the international community will know that they didn't conform to it. That means we have to do something at the end of the day, because the message is already sent to them that they are doing something wrong. This is where the contradiction came in their case, because number one, they wanted to defend the fact of organic change, and then they also wanted other countries to intervene, and they wanted things like international pressure to place upon them. We'll still deal with both paradigms.
Number one, we didn't know the idea that is undermined within both international pressure and organic change. Number one, it's a time-sensitive issue. It's going to take too long if you want to stand for organic change, or even if you want international pressure to take place, because the international pressure will only take place as they characterize as after the country is globalized, after the country can stand on its own 2 feet, after the country is already successful with all the aid that you've given them. We think it's going to take far too long to wait for that situation. But secondly, even if the situation, even if it's happened and it's in a fast way anyway, but why is it still bad that other countries intervene? If we have a way to solve it, if we have the way to impose values that are good, that stop human rights violation at the end of the day, without using violence, without using things that don't make you understand why are you oppressing your people, why are you going against the human rights at the end of the day that the people are supposed to have, why not use it? Because even if international pressure is existed, then you're going to use international communities. That means people have to go into intervening, or people have to go into sanction them, or people are going to have to use other measures that involve other international or other countries, which increase the amount of pressure upon them, because they're going to react on a basis that they are scared. They're going to react on a basis that they don't have that capacity to go against all of them, because they won't understand why they shouldn't pressure their people. Because what's best for that situation now is that when you have conditional aid, the people will have to explain, or there will be some form of discourse that will happen, or some form of negotiation that will happen between the country that receives the developmental aid and the country that gives the developmental aid, because they need to know what's going on. They need to know why they're suppressing the people's rights at the end of the day, because they have a right, because they gave you that aid in the first place. The second level to this issue is that they talked about on the idea that how the majority will antagonize the minority, and their reason is that the reason that they're not giving aid is because of the minority, and the majority is going to feel that way. Number one, that's more of a reason why they'll accept our policy. That's more of a reason why the majority will feel that they are being punished for something that is unfair. So that's more of the reason why the government will accept our policy into having the conditional aid. But secondly, why can't this be a chance for them to realize? Why can't this be a chance for the majority to realize that there has been something going wrong? Maybe these people shouldn't be suppressed at the end of the day. But even if they don't realize, even if they don't change their mindset at the end of the day, we prevent an objective harm, which is human rights violations. We prevent them from being harmed by the majority. We prevent them from being harmed by the society at the end of the day. We don't think anything harmful is imposed in this value anyway. The second level, the implementation that you bring upon the people, because they talked about the idea of how you will, somehow you will resort to other countries, and now the people will still continually be oppressed by the government or by the leaders of the country. Even if you have been receiving aid from that particular country, like Malawi, been receiving aid from UK for so long, if suddenly they withdraw, or if suddenly they withhold the aid that you've been giving them all these years, obviously they're going to realize, or they're going to understand, that there is something really wrong with the policy that I'm setting. There's something really wrong with the way that I'm treating my people. At the end of the day, this is already a way for them to realize. It's already an avenue for them to change. But before I move on, sure.
Okay, of course they will realize that something's wrong. But will your dictator take a positive change, or will they draw the minorities as a strong man?
See, if the positive change is higher under our policy, because there is a chance for discourse, there is a chance of discourse, because it's conditional aid. Under your policy, if you're going to wait for that country to be globalized, and you're going to wait for the country to be internationally pressured, then that's when there is no positive change, because he's going to be a negative reaction, because he's only going to react to the international pressure, because he's never going to understand that. Let's take an example of welfare. When we withdraw welfare, you're not trying to get out of that situation. These are circumstances where we don't care if that situation is something unfortunate, and you can get out of the situation, and it's a situation that will benefit everyone, because if we can give welfare to only certain amount of people, and you restrict the idea for us to give welfare to everyone, for the more number of people, we tell you that we take away that right, because you harm that power that we already give you. This also the circumstance that will parallel to this debate, because they wanted to talk the idea about how people pretend to be nice, how it's going to be an institutionalized racism. Even if people pretend to be nice to a certain group of minority, we already have constant checkups. We have monitoring by the country that gives you developmental aid. There's constant visits. There's a good relationship between both countries. We don't think they'll run away with being nice to the minority. For all those reasons, please cite the sense of
Thank you, You're welcome.
Okay, let me begin. When Kishan told us that he's making a trade-off with today's debate, where this debate becomes about a lesser or two evils, whether the people are oppressed, but they still have all sorts of where they still have infrastructure, where they still are able to exist and have the basic rights, but they're still being oppressed, and draw a parallel to the other situation where they are being oppressed anyway at a certain harm, is that he forgets to understand that there's a very fine line between when a country is fully developed and when a country has really gone independent from the developmental aid and going into the stage where they can use the developmental aid to change, to oppress you, right? There's a very fine line to be drawn. We don't think that the change when it occurs, we don't think that the change when it occurs, it will be holistic. We only think the change when it occurs has to come through organic change and has to come through international pressure where other countries impose sanctions on them. Then when you look into it further, why did outside of the house, why did we talk about things that were more effective at the end of the day? Because when you have international pressure towards these countries already are in the limelight. Sit down. These countries are already in the limelight of other people. These countries have a greater amount of focus by all these other countries because there is a competing market for other countries to fund these nations, right? Because they want to deal with these people. These countries under outside of the house, there'll be more pressure for these countries for organic change to happen. At the end of the day, outside of the house, we sit down. At the end of the day, outside of the house seeks to solve the problem of hate, because at the end of the day, when you talk about the outside of the house, hate only needs to be stopped. Hate only needs to be stopped. Hate only needs to be stopped in face value. All they need to do is just not oppress these people for a certain while, and even though you come up and do checkups all this while, people at the end of the day, when they become independent of your aid, they're going to oppress these people anyway. There's a very fine line. We don't think that they did enough justification to prove why this line is. They didn't have any justification to prove that this line is very concrete in today's debate, and that is why we won. Before I go on to my issues, yes.
It is international pressure, and everybody recognizes that victimization is wrong. Why would the black market aid or countries like China still give these people aid if they also recognize and they're also part of the condemnation and the pressure of making them recognize the rest of the world?
There won't be international pressure from countries like China, for example, because they don't prioritize people from being oppressed, right? These countries don't have stringent conditions. Now you're talking about countries who offer a high amount of money to your country, like like Britain as compared to China. Britain can provide more money, but the difference here is Britain, although recognizing there is human rights violation although recognizing that there are human rights violations that exist, Britain is still able to keep this form of connection, to keep this form of focus, and that is why we believe, in solving this problem of hate, right? They talk about the established infrastructure, that the aid won't be spent in the interest of all people. We counter this by saying that when you talk about your ultimate goal of letting the infrastructure being exclusive, not when you talk about the ultimate goal of letting this infrastructure being inclusive to everyone within society, right? You're not really stopping this hate from happening, right? The hate that has been developing for all this while, there will still be hate that happens, right? It's just that when the people become independent from that, for that aid, like I said again, there's a very fine line to becoming even more powerful and even more harder to stop, and that is why we believe that at the end of the day, all the harms that they talked about will definitely happen, because they assume that once the countries get the developmental aid, they will automatically change, and somehow this change is for the good. And that's why we even question their ability to change in the ability to change in the first place, right? Because at the end of the day, if the change, if they find it really that hard to change, right? Then why would, if they find it really that hard to change, then why would they even accept your developmental aid in the first place? They will just continue using, continue using that money to systematically oppress the people. Now, we say that, sit down. At the end of the day, when you compare two sides of the house, when it comes to solving the problem of hate within society, when you leave it to these countries being developed, or when you leave the conditions, when you leave the condition to be still there, you allow for these countries to still have a say in what these other countries do. You're not giving them the autonomy to do completely whatever they want to do, but you're allowing a certain condition that you want organic change to happen. That is the message you want to send out. The organic change versus the change that will happen that is fake under your side of the house. We do it better and we do it more realistically, and the people at the end of the day won't even have to worry about being oppressed in any way, shape or form, because like I said to you earlier, both of my previous speakers, there's a very fine line to be drawn, and we think that this fine line has to be removed, and people have to be changed. The mindset is people have to be changed completely, right? Because at the end of the day, at least when you talk about it, when you talk about implications here, cooperation and all the benefits that they talk about, yes, they can exist. But the cooperation between the government and the people, the magnitude of this cooperation can also be used to talk about the converse of benefiting the people, right? If they have the magnitude of all this infrastructure and they have the possibility of using it for the benefit, and the hate still exists, then what is stopping them from not using this opportunity for cooperation? What is stopping them from using this magnitude of infrastructure to hate these people? We don't think that they change anything at the end of the day, and you don't. Majority of the people won't realize the freedoms that they need to realize. So at the end of the day, because we focus on organic change compared to their case, which won't really help this nation solve the problem of hate in the long run, we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Opposition with, opposition advice.
Look here, opposition is not trying to be nice. Opposition is trying to be as pragmatic as possible to ensure that this problem can be solved in the most clinical way. Of course, in the short term, a few human rights have to be violated, but at the end of the day, we still seek to protect it in the long run, right? We tell you that even though in the short run, these states, these oppressive states will continue to oppress, but we tell you that if we are willing to take a look at this problem over the course of like decades, or years or decades, right? We will actually yield the better result here. So this leads to my first question. What have our side proven to you? Our side have proven to you, the first thing is we want to apply international pressure, and beyond that we also want to apply the chance for organic change beyond that, to ensure that the state will come to a conclusion that what they've done fundamentally is wrong in the first place. Because what Daiwei argued to you is this: we need this developmental aid to create infrastructure like schools, right? And this globalization will also a more globally progressive mindset. We tell you beyond that, even if they are unwilling to change, even if they are so stubborn, right? We tell you when you are on a global level, there will be international pressure to keep you in check and balance. Now, second idea is the idea of false pretense. How they will only disguise themselves as being towards humane, right? But at the end of the day, when they've amassed already enough sufficient developmental aid, they don't already have to comply with you, and they can also seek aid from other countries that are less stringent, like Russia or China. Let's just look at the idea of Syria itself, right? Russia is so proud to defend Bashar al-Assad, and Russia doesn't even seem to shy away from the fact that they've been funding Bashar al-Assad, right? We see that Russia is also willing to fund countries like Malawi if they come and ask for it, as long as there's some economic benefit for them at the end of the day. This is something that opposition has tried to prove, the black market of developmental aid. Now, what have government proven? Government have proven how does this importance for social structure in the country. The government has proven how dictators would react directly to the kind of developmental aid retraction, right? We tell you that we do not disagree with that, but we are trying to put on a balance which side is trying to achieve this problem, trying to achieve a solution better. Both sides are taking radically different ways, and it can be done if we put it on a balance and contrast and contrast. So government operates on the assumption that this sudden urgency will actually spark complete change in their mentality towards being more humane. We tell you that when the minorities are being so blindly oppressed, right, what will inspire them to suddenly change their mindset when they can actually seek aid from their neighbors or from other global players that are less stringent, like what I've said. And we tell you that beyond that, even if we tell you that dictators are not stupid, we concede to the fact that dictators will understand what's actually wrong in their country. They may be voluntarily oppressing these people in the first place. Well, we tell you what kind of actions will dictators take if this kind of developmental aid is being rejected. Chances are dictators won't even bother to address the problem positively, to create a positive change in the country, to comply with these standards. Right? We tell you that dictators will only just spread propaganda and further antagonize these minorities, while at the same time go through the back door to look for others alternatives. So we are telling you that it is better for Malawi to bow down to UK than for Malawi to bow down to other countries like Russia and China, where they don't really have a standard for human rights, that kind of a thing. Right? So at the end of the day, opposition is not trying to be idealistic and be nice. We are trying to be pragmatic. We are trying to solve a very serious problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Now to conclude the debate, I'll now welcome the government vice minister.
Globalized pressure and a globalized mindset is something that said opposition tried to achieve but could not address. Because the very fact that these individuals are still part of this community, and that's something that was pushed down through all three of our speakers, the very fact that they've been kept in the dark for this entire time, the very fact that they've been brainwashed into believing that these minorities are individuals who are supposed to be negated, who are supposed to be discriminated, they can't ensure to us that the moment they reach this limelight, which they might not even achieve in the first place, that doesn't mean that just because you become a developed country, more countries will start paying more attention to you. There is no assurance that these individuals will shift stances based on threats, based on these individuals giving scrutiny towards these countries and taking hardline stances like intervention, which has severe consequences, things they chose to not respond to. But side opposition's case also pragmatic one more thing, that the black market of aid, which is one we already responded to, because they try to tell us that these countries will go to more stringent countries like Russia, countries like China, who don't care about moral standards, who don't care about anything. All they care about is just making some form of economic change. The problem with this is the characterization that came from opposition, and the characterization is that international pressure condemns, and international pressure compels these developed countries into reforming, and international pressure forces these countries into accepting human rights in circumstances. That can happen in a world where China and Russia in itself are also pressured into making these kinds of decisions, when China and Russia in itself are also pressured into accepting the fact that they can't always be stringent and they can't always look for the best form of economic change. So if they want to argue that international pressure exists, it should exist in an exclusive manner, because at the end of the day, these companies and these countries have to be internationally pressured into not funding these forms of countries, because that is what's acceptable and that is what's not within the international community. But another response that came to us is you can't just jump aid givers the moment you receive some form of threat. Like it's unreasonable to just deny aid from UK and just go to Russia because you already made plans with all the money that is necessarily being given. We don't necessarily see a link there. But there's two issues for you to raise debate. Firstly, oppression on three levels. Firstly, how do we deal with it? Because the entire case that came from opposition was that we can only deal with oppression in a manner where every other country is involved in this. We told you no, it can only happen. It can happen mutually, right? It can happen when you can reduce and minimize all the harms, so not allowing an intervention and doing things like cutting aid from these individuals. Second level, which side further antagonizes minorities? Because this is something both sides of the house agree on. We agree that minorities are being discriminated, but the comparison then becomes, is it better for these minorities to get liberties, to be able to use and facilitate schools and things like hospitals, or them under their paradigm, their worst and extreme harm, just be discriminated within these kinds of circumstances? Their harms happen under their paradigm even more. But the third and last question, the use of developmental aid in oppression. Because they never understood that when these countries get this developmental aid, they use it in a manner that secludes all these people from these kinds of circumstances. So they negated my argument entirely as to how this country progresses within these kinds of societies. The moment that they're antagonized, the moment that they're secluded from society, we can ensure that when your human rights are being given, you have the right to stand up for yourself. You have the right to have discourse within these kinds of circumstances. You have the right to all these forms of liberties. And the last level, using current, this tells that you're going to use current resources. Things like resources, which they never assume will run out at some point. These countries are in itself, some countries, they have to make some form of decision. So if this country didn't, that the leaders and dictators of this country didn't want to be overthrown, we can assume that they will take this deal. They can't just run on their current resources. Second issue, independence. Because they try to tell us, can laws be disguised? This is the bulk of the argumentation. Can laws be discussed? No, we told you in itself, it's whether this person gets to exercise the liberty or whether this person does not. There's no way of negating this law in a sense, and there's no way of adjusting it to your own biasness. Because in itself, it's already basic to begin with. So at the end of the day, it's whether this person gets these kinds of liberties, and we already told you that we checked for these kinds of circumstances, which is something they also don't negate. The last and final level to this issue. Because they try to tell us it's institutionalized racism. The racism that you create is the racism that you're fine with these people being discriminated. You're only going to take action when these people are in the limelight, which is something that the government will never stand for. We're very proud of people.